hair's a little crazy, we're in a pandemic, you know, you'll have to excuse. Alright, so today I'm going to be adding Google Maps to my South Florida Tech job board. And I'm going to go through everything except for how to set up the API key. Because Google already has really good documentation and even a YouTube video that walks you through that process step by step. So with that said, let's get going. The very first thing I'm going to do here is load up the API. Once the API is loaded, we should have access to a variable called Google. So let's check if everything is working correctly by console logging that variable. And it doesn't seem to be working, but if I type in Google into the console, all of a sudden it does seem to exist, so why am I getting this error? Well, I'm getting this error because the file that calls console.log is loading and executing before the Maps API is done loading. So at the time that this code ran, Google really wasn't available yet. Luckily, Google provides a parameter called callback. And what this script will do is, it will grab whatever value you put inside that parameter, look for a function by that name in your code, and execute that function when it's done loading the script. So if you have some code that needs to wait for the script to load, like this console.log, you put it in that function. So let's try that console.log again, but this time wrapping it inside of a function that I'll call maps loaded for now. And you'll see that if I run this code again, this time I don't get an error. Now let's check the documentation to see how we can use that variable to render a map. And it looks like the code requires three things: coordinates to set the map on, the level of zoom, and an HTML element to place the map inside. So let's set that up really quick, starting with the HTML, which will just be a simple div with the class of CMap. Next, let's take care of the coordinates. I'm not doing anything fancy to get the coordinates for each location. I'm just getting them manually from the Google Maps website and saving them to my database. For now, I'll put the coordinates right in the HTML inside of data attributes on the CMap element. And I'll come back and show you how I'm going to use that in just a second. The question right now is, where does this code go? The trick is that this code relies on both the Maps API and the HTML it's going to go in. So I have to make sure that those are done loading before I try to run this code, or I'll get an error and the map will never render. Not to mention, I don't want to run this code on every page. I just want to run it on the pages that use a map. And the callback I mentioned earlier takes care of making sure that the API is loaded, so I could put it there, but it doesn't check if I'm in the right page or if the HTML is loaded. Again, all it checks for is that the API is ready, so that won't be enough. Instead, I'm going to use a solution I got from Chris Oliver over at GoRails using Stimulus.js. If you don't know what Stimulus is, don't worry. I'm going to write the code and I'll explain it as I go. First thing I'm going to do is use that callback to fire a custom event, which I'll call maps loaded. And really quick, I'm going to rename the callback in the HTML header to fire maps loaded event. Okay, so now when the API is done loading, it'll call this function, which will fire my custom event. And it's important to remember that the event will only fire once when the Maps API is done loading. Next up, I'm going to use Stimulus to set an event listener on the HTML element where the map will go. The way you do that with Stimulus is through data action attributes. So I'll set one on my div to listen for the Maps loaded event on the document object. And when it hears that event, it should go to the Maps Stimulus controller, which I haven't created yet, and execute the render map function. Stimulus also requires a data controller attribute to link this HTML document and the Stimulus controller together, and a target data attribute so I can access this HTML element in the JavaScript. So I'll create that Stimulus Maps controller. And inside of that controller, I'll create the render map function, which is where I'll put my Google Maps code. This Google Maps code is from the docs, so I have to replace a few things. The first thing I'm going to replace is the HTML element. Remember I told you I can access the HTML element because of the data target attribute I put on it. That was only half the story. I also have to put the value inside that attribute in an array that Stimulus calls targets. And now I can access that HTML element with a variable that Stimulus created for this target called coordinates target. So I'm going to grab the coordinates, store their latitude and longitude data attributes, and combine those into one object for the Maps API. And as it is, this code will probably work now, but I'm not done yet. Because all I've done with this code so far is I've said, as soon as the Maps API is done loading, render the map. But what happens if the Maps API loads and the Maps loaded event fires before the HTML has finished loading? Well, the event listener would never hear the event, which means render map never runs and the map never loads. Luckily, there's an easy fix with Stimulus, because Stimulus has a lifecycle method called connect, which it executes after the HTML and Stimulus controller are done loading. So I'll call render map inside of connect, but first I'll make sure that the API is finished loading by checking for the Google variable. So here are the two scenarios. Scenario A, the Maps API loads before the HTML. The Maps loaded function fires, but since the event listener hasn't loaded yet, nothing happens. Then, when the HTML is done loading, it executes the connect function, which executes render map. And I have my map. Great. Scenario B, the Maps API loads after the HTML. So Stimulus executes connect, but Google isn't available yet, so it doesn't execute render map. When the API does finish loading, it'll call the fire maps loaded event function, which fires the maps loaded event, which our HTML will hear and immediately execute the render map function. Either way, I've made sure that both maps and the HTML are ready, and I'm only calling the maps code on the pages that need it. One last thing I'd like to mention is that you have to give the map HTML element CSS dimensions, or it probably won't show up. And finally, let's take a look to see if this is working. So we'll go back to the browser, to our jobs page, open up this job, and something is wrong. Error connecting to controller, uncaught in premise. Okay, let's go back to check our code. The first thing I see here is I made a mistake. This should be targets. Okay. And the second mistake is that this should be fire maps loaded event. Let's see anything else. Map. Okay, let's see if that works. So we'll go here, refresh the page. All right, and we have our map. Awesome. Now I'm going to add a few other options to kind of make that nicer. I'm going to zoom in a lot more, and I'm going to remove some of the controls from the map. So full screen control to false, street view control, false, and map type control false. These should, let's see if that works. Awesome, I got everything except street view. Maybe that's this. And there I go. I got the street views off. I'm much more zoomed in. One last thing I would like to add here is a marker at the center of the map. So let's see how we can do that. Google Maps JavaScript API marker. And here it is. So it looks like that's the code to add a marker. Let's go back to VS Code, paste, put the marker in the same coordinates as our map, put it in the map that we already have on there, and maybe that's enough. Let's try it out. Refresh. There it is. We got our map, we got our marker. I cleaned up the controls. This is it. Let's see how it looks on mobile. Let's see, iPhone 6. Great. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that was helpful, and I hope you subscribe.